In the early decades of the 16th century, Europe stood on the precipice of transformation, its landscape marked by not only the intricate tapestry of feudal loyalties and burgeoning nation-states, but also by a profound and unsettling undercurrent of dissent. This period, characterized by a palpable tension between tradition and emerging ideas, created fertile ground for the Reformation, a seismic shift that would redefine the religious and cultural contours of the continent. Indeed, while the printing press, invented by Johannes Gutenberg in the mid-1450s, is often heralded as the spark igniting this radical change, it is crucial to recognize that it merely amplified pre-existing voices of discontent, functioning as a catalyst rather than a creator of the Reformation. Driven by an increasingly literate populace, the sentiments of dissatisfaction with the Catholic Church were already taking shape well before Martin Luther famously nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the Castle Church in Wittenberg in 1517. The rise of universities and an expanding merchant class fostered a new culture of inquiry and critical thought. By the dawn of the 16th century, literacy rates were steadily climbing, particularly in urban areas. Consequently, the populace was no longer content to accept the doctrines of the clergy without question. A letter penned in 1506 by a disillusioned priest reveals this discontent. The faithful seek truth not wrapped in golden chalices, but in the simplicity of the Word. Such sentiments were becoming more common as the fervor for reform simmered just beneath the surface of everyday life. Inevitably, it was this growing restlessness that created a precarious balance between adherence to tradition and the yearning for change. Indeed, the Catholic Church itself was acutely aware of the brewing storm. As early as 1510, when the papal emissary sent to Germany reported on the rampant corruption and the widespread sale of indulgences, payments for the forgiveness of sins, it became clear that the institution was vulnerable. The papacy, entrenched in its opulence and bureaucracy, struggled to maintain its moral authority in the face of an increasingly critical populace. The discontent was not merely theological, it was also social and political. In an era where the concept of nationhood was gaining ground, many saw the Church as an alien power, its interests often misaligned with those of the burgeoning states. The voices of reformers like Jan Hus and John Wycliffe had laid the groundwork for a call to return to the Scriptures, emphasizing personal faith over institutional authority. Their teachings, though suppressed, had not disappeared. Rather, they simmered in the minds of many, waiting for the right moment to resurface. In this setting, the advent of the printing press can be seen not as the spark, but as the wind fanning the flames of an already kindling fire. The technology, which allowed for the rapid dissemination of literature, was revolutionary. It provided a platform for dissenters to share their ideas, and as pamphlets spread across the continent, they began to articulate the frustrations of the masses. A pamphlet published in 1518 titled The Address to the German Nobility was one such document, arguing for the reform of the Church and the return of power to local authorities. This text, along with others, reached far beyond the learned elite, crossing social boundaries and engaging the common man. Driven by this newfound access to information, an increasingly disillusioned populace began to question the infallibility of the papacy and the practices of the Church, emboldened by the realization that they were not alone in their dissent. The printing press, therefore, functioned as a vital tool of amplification, allowing voices of reform to resonate across vast distances. Luther's works, once confined to the walls of a monastery, were whispered in hushed tones in dimly lit taverns, found their way into the hands of merchants, artisans, and even peasant farmers. The emotional weight of a handwritten letter sent from a frustrated parishioner to the local bishop could be multiplied by the thousands through the press, transforming individual grievances into a collective roar. This shift from oral to printed communication marked a profound change. Ideas that once circulated through whispers now held the power of mass communication. This shift was not without consequences. Numerous uprisings, such as the Peasants' War of 1524 to 1525, reflected the deep-seated frustrations that had been articulated through printed texts, illustrating how the Reformation of thought could lead to very tangible revolts against authority. Yet the fragility of this historical moment reveals a counterfactual tension. Had the printing press not emerged when it did, or had certain texts not reached critical audiences at pivotal times, the Reformation could have unfolded very differently. Imagine a world where the pamphlets condemning the Church's practices were intercepted, never reaching the hands of the disillusioned. In this scenario, the Church may have continued to dominate the spiritual landscape of Europe, as it had for centuries, stifling dissent with greater ferocity. The resonant echo of the voice of the faithful, fearful of being silenced, would have remained just that, a distant echo rather than a clarion call for reform. Amidst these grand narratives of societal upheaval, the human stories remain paramount. Consider a young woman named Agnes, a humble villager in Bavaria, who, upon receiving a pamphlet critiquing the sale of indulgences, found herself questioning the very fabric of her faith. Armed with the newfound knowledge that salvation could be attained without monetary exchange, she began to gather like-minded individuals in her community, creating a small yet fervent circle of reformers. Her name may have been lost to history, but her story represents countless others who, inspired by the printed word, became active participants in a movement that would soon engulf Europe. As we trace this intricate web of influence, we see how the printing press, while not the birthplace of the Reformation, served as its indispensable amplifier. It allowed the collective discontent and desire for change to transcend regional and social barriers, igniting a movement that would reshape Christianity itself. The legacy of these events reverberate into our modern world. The principles of free expression and the democratization of knowledge, born from this tumultuous era, remain central to our contemporary discourse. The echoes of Agnes and her peers remind us that history is not merely a succession of events, but a tapestry woven from the threads of individual lives and collective aspirations. In this way, the printing press stands not only as a mechanical wonder, but as a symbol of the unquenchable human thirst for truth, independence, and reform.
The late 15th and early 16th centuries were a time of profound tension within the Catholic Church, an institution that had long wielded considerable influence over the lives of millions across Europe. As the spirit of the age began to shift, characterized by a growing questioning of established authority and dogma, figures like Martin Luther and John Wycliffe emerged as pivotal voices, challenging the ecclesiastical status quo. Driven by a combination of personal conviction and a burgeoning awareness of widespread ecclesiastical corruption, these reformers articulated theological and moral arguments that resonated deeply with a populace grappling with the implications of faith, power, and the human condition. Consequently, the seeds of Reformation were sown, setting in motion a chain of events that would irrevocably alter the landscape of Christianity and European society. At the heart of this discontent lay the stark realization of moral decay within the Church. The 95 Theses, penned by Martin Luther in 1517, emerged not merely as a critique of indulgences, but as a broader denunciation of the corruption that had come to define ecclesiastical practices. Luther, a former monk whose own struggles with faith led him to a profound theological awakening, argued that salvation could not be bought. His assertion that faith alone, sola fide, was the sole means of attaining grace struck a chord with many who had long felt disenfranchised by the Church's grasp on spiritual authority. Thus, driven by the fervor of his conviction and the desire for reform, Luther's critique catalyzed a movement that would flourish, fueled by the rapid dissemination of ideas made possible by the printing press. This technology, which had only recently emerged as a revolutionary force, allowed Luther's works to spread across Europe, reaching a population eager for change. In this environment, the written word became an instrument of dissent, laying the groundwork for a transformation that was at once spiritual and socio-political. Meanwhile, John Wycliffe, a precursor to Luther, had set the stage for this upheaval a century earlier. His challenges to the Church's authority, particularly in advocating for the translation of the Bible into the vernacular, placed him at odds with ecclesiastical leaders. Wycliffe believed that a personal relationship with the divine was paramount, a belief that ran counter to the Church's insistence on clerical mediation. Consequently, the ideas he espoused began to cultivate a sense of personal agency among believers, who were starting to question the necessity of institutional oversight. This early voice of dissent, however, was not without consequence. Wycliffe's followers, known as the Lollards, faced persecution, yet their tenacity in the face of oppression drew attention to the faults within the Church. The echoes of his teachings lingered, creating a fertile ground for Luther's eventual emergence. As these currents of thought began to coalesce, the psychological landscape of Europe was undergoing a seismic shift. The spirit of inquiry that characterized the Renaissance began to permeate the populace, fostering an environment in which questioning authority became both a necessity and a virtue. This cultural awakening coincided with unabated ecclesiastical corruption, exemplified by the sale of indulgences, which many perceived as a blatant exploitation of faith. Driven by this growing disillusionment, the populace began to rally around the reformers, viewing them not just as dissenters, but as champions of a more personal and authentic form of Christianity. This burgeoning grassroots movement represented a profound change in the collective psyche. People were no longer passive adherents, but active participants in the discourse surrounding faith and morality. The impact of ecclesiastical corruption was underscored by tangible realities. For instance, the lavish lifestyles of bishops, showcased in opulent residences and extravagant ceremonies, stood in stark contrast to the struggles of ordinary believers, many of whom lived in abject poverty. In 1520, Luther himself would describe the Church as a corrupt institution in a letter to Pope Leo X, a statement that would reverberate throughout Christendom. Consequently, this corruption not only alienated the faithful, but also instigated a sense of urgency for reform. It became increasingly apparent that the Church's failure to address the moral and spiritual needs of its followers was driving a wedge between the institution and the people it claimed to serve. As Luther's ideas gained traction and spread beyond the borders of Germany, the response from ecclesiastical authorities was swift and severe.
excommunications and declarations of heresy aimed to silence dissent, yet these efforts only fueled the fire of reform. The counter-response of the Church inadvertently highlighted the growing divide between the institution and an increasingly literate populace, one that was no longer willing to accept dogma without question. In a notable instance, when Luther publicly burned the papal bull condemning him, it served as a powerful symbol of defiance, igniting a movement that would soon spiral beyond individual city-states into a widespread challenge to the very foundations of Catholicism. While the actions of prominent reformers were crucial, the broader grassroots movements of reform must not be overlooked. Many communities began to embrace the idea of a church reformed from within, advocating for local governance of religious practices and the establishment of congregational autonomy. In towns such as Zurich, the teachings of reformers like Ulrich Zwingli gathered momentum, reflecting a desire for a faith that resonated with the realities of everyday life. These movements were not merely localized, but indicative of a larger trend towards individualism and self-determination, a reflection of the zeitgeist that was fundamentally altering the relationship between the faithful and the institution of the Church. While the tide of reform seemed inexorable, the fragility of history was evident in many moments that could have altered its course. Had Luther chosen to remain silent after witnessing the injustices surrounding him, or if the printing press had not existed to disseminate his writings, the Reformation might have flickered out before it ever ignited. Each decision, each act of courage was a thread in a complex tapestry of consequence, setting the stage for a divide that would deepen and broaden in the years to come. In the wake of these developments, the legacy of the Reformation would reverberate far beyond the confines of theology. It laid the groundwork for modern notions of individual rights, freedom of conscience, and the very concept of secular governance that continues to shape our societies today. As the voices of dissent transformed into a clarion call for change, they illuminated the path towards a reimagined faith, one that emphasized personal connection over institutional mediation. The seeds of reformation sown in the crucible of that tumultuous period would grow into a legacy that persists in the ongoing quest for authenticity in belief and the pursuit of justice within the human experience.
As the early 16th century unfurled, the landscape of Europe was undergoing a seismic transformation. The stirrings of Protestant thought, fueled by figures such as Martin Luther and John Calvin, began to etch themselves into the collective consciousness, challenging not only theological doctrines, but the very fabric of authority that the Catholic Church had woven over the centuries. This burgeoning movement, marked by its embrace of personal faith and a direct relationship with Scripture, incited both fervor and fear within the papal halls of power. Driven by this existential threat to its supremacy, the Catholic Church embarked on a campaign to reclaim its influence, culminating in the Counter-Reformation, a decisive response to the Protestant Reformation that would reshape the religious and political dynamics of Europe. Inevitably, the first major step in this revitalization effort was the Council of Trent, convened amid a whirlwind of accusations and dissent. Meeting in 3 sessions between 1545 and 1563, this ecumenical council sought to address the myriad issues raised by Protestant reformers, while simultaneously reaffirming Catholic doctrine. The decrees of Trent, noted one historian, were not merely defensive. They sought to make the Church more robust and engaging, to win hearts and minds through a revitalized pastoral approach. Consequently, the Council's reforms set forth a clear vision,
a church not only of ancient traditions, but one vibrant with reformed practices, which would resonate throughout the faithful. As this ecclesiastical restructuring unfolded, the specter of the Inquisition loomed large. Established in the 12th century, but given renewed vigor by the Counter-Reformation, the Inquisition functioned as both a spiritual and political tool. The Church sought to root out heresy and maintain orthodoxy, often resorting to methods that would strike fear into the hearts of dissenters. The notorious Index of Forbidden Books, a product of the Council's deliberations, served as a grim reminder of the lengths to which the Church would go to control the narrative, restricting access to texts that contradicted Catholic teachings. Letters from the time frequently depicted the atmosphere of paranoia that enveloped communities as neighbors turned against one another, driven by the fear of being accused of heresy. Consequently, this environment not only stoked the flames of conflict, but also forged a lasting legacy of mistrust that would permeate European society for generations. The Counter-Reformation was not merely a religious movement, it intertwined deeply with the political landscape of the time. As Protestant factions carved out territories of influence in regions like Germany and Switzerland, Catholic powers rallied to defend their hegemony. The ambition of rulers such as Philip II of Spain reflected this intertwining of faith and politics. A devout Catholic, Philip viewed the defense of the Church as a sacred duty, culminating in military campaigns designed to quash Protestant uprisings and extend Catholic dominion. His relentless pursuit of this goal culminated in the Spanish Armada's ill-fated expedition against England in 1588, an endeavor aimed at re-establishing Catholic rule and countering the Protestant tide, a historical moment rendered even more poignant by the eventual defeat that would shift the balance of power in Europe. Thus, the stakes were raised as each military engagement became a reflection of a deeper ideological struggle, one that would set the stage for future conflicts, including the 30 Years' War. Yet, amidst this backdrop of grandeur and might, individual lives were irrevocably altered. Consider a young priest, barely in his 20s, who had dedicated himself to the principles of the Counter-Reformation. He was assigned to a parish in the heart of the Spanish Netherlands, where whispers of Protestant sympathies echoed through the cobblestone streets. Driven by a fervent desire to serve, he preached passionately against heresy, even as he felt the cold weight of fear settle upon him. Fear of being denounced, of becoming a target of the Inquisition. One fateful night, as he prepared his sermon, a knock on the door shattered his resolve. Had he chosen his words more carefully in the pulpit, perhaps his fate would have been different. Instead, he would find himself confronting the Inquisition's terrifying machinery, a victim of the very zeal he sought to champion. Compounding this tragic narrative was the burgeoning political rivalry that these religious struggles incited. The schism between Protestant and Catholic states created a patchwork of alliances and enmities that would shape Europe's geopolitical landscape. The alignment of France with Protestant factions during the French Wars of Religion, a decision born from a desire to undermine Habsburg dominance, highlighted how deeply interconnected the threads of faith and politics had become. These alliances often led to brutal conflicts, as seen in the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of 1572, where thousands of Huguenots were killed in a conflict that was as much about power as it was about faith. Consequently, the entrenchment of these rivalries would not merely reshape borders, but also sow the seeds of animosity that would persist well into the modern era. As the specter of the Counter-Reformation loomed larger, the psychological state of Europe was marked by a profound sense of urgency and existential dread. With each passing year, the stakes felt increasingly dire. The fate of souls was at risk, and the very essence of Christendom was perceived to hang in the balance. Amidst this backdrop of turmoil, the Catholic Church's response revealed not only a desire for reclamation, but a fundamental transformation in how power was wielded. The syncretism of theology and statecraft introduced by the Church's efforts would lead to a legacy of conflict and compromise, an indelible mark on the European psyche. Thus, the Counter-Reformation emerged not merely as an ecclesiastical response, but as a dynamic interplay of faith, power, and the relentless march of history. The conflicts ignited by this era laid the groundwork for the modern nation-state, a legacy that continues to inform contemporary religious and political landscapes. In many ways, the echoes of these tumultuous times still resonate today, shaping debates over authority, belief, and the enduring struggle for influence in an increasingly fragmented world.
In the tumultuous landscape of the mid-16th century, Europe found itself embroiled in a series of conflicts that were as much about faith as they were about governance. The Protestant Reformation, ignited by figures like Martin Luther, had shattered the monolithic authority of the Catholic Church, sending shockwaves through the Holy Roman Empire. Driven by a relentless quest for theological clarity and individual autonomy, adherents of the new faith clashed with traditionalists in a struggle that was both ideological and deeply personal. This atmosphere of fervor and division set the stage for the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, a pivotal moment that would alter the course of European history. The Peace of Augsburg emerged not merely as an agreement to end hostilities, but as a formal recognition of the coexistence of Catholicism and Lutheranism within the empire. The edict, encapsulated in the phrase "Cuius regio, eius religio," meaning whose realm, his religion, articulated a fundamental shift in the political and spiritual dynamics of the time. Consequently, the principle established that princes could determine the fate of their own territories, forcing a realignment of allegiances and identities. This was a remarkable concession, born of the need to quell the bloodshed that had stained the landscape with conflict and martyrdom. The psychological state of the era was one of fatigue. The populace, wearied by decades of warfare and social upheaval, hungered for stability, even at the cost of their spiritual uniformity. The negotiations leading up to the Augsburg settlement were fraught with tension, each side seeking to articulate its vision of a peaceful coexistence. It was a moment marked by fragile compromises, something that could have unraveled at any instant. Had the Lutheran princes not been willing to abandon their more radical demands, or had the Emperor, Charles V, not recognized the futility of continuing the conflict, the very essence of the empire might have been irrevocably altered. An anonymous scribe, furiously penning notes in a dimly lit chamber as the debates raged, captured the urgency of the moment, writing of a nation on the knife's edge, with every word carrying the weight of lives lived and lost. As the treaty was ratified, it became clear that the Peace of Augsburg was not simply a cessation of hostilities. It heralded a new era of religious tolerance, albeit a limited one. The treaty granted legitimacy to Lutheranism, but did not extend this recognition to other reformist movements, such as Calvinism. Consequently, the fissures within Christendom only deepened, laying the groundwork for future strife.
The tensions simmered just below the surface as the religious landscape became increasingly fractured. Across borders, communities began to grapple with the implications of their rulers' choices, leading to a patchwork of belief systems that would define the continent for centuries to come. In the years following the Peace of Augsburg, the political structures of Europe began to reflect this newfound coexistence. The authority of the Holy Roman Emperor, already weakened by various conflicts, became increasingly dependent on the allegiance of local princes. In this environment, power dynamics shifted significantly. Rulers were compelled to navigate the delicate balance between religious convictions and political expediency. As a result, the empire saw the rise of influential city-states and regional powers, each asserting its identity in the context of its chosen faith. Individual lives were forever altered by these sweeping changes. Take, for instance, the story of a young woman named Anna, living in the small town of Strasbourg. Raised in a devout Catholic family, she found herself torn between her upbringing and the burgeoning influence of her Lutheran peers. As the edict granted legitimacy to the new faith, Anna was faced with a choice that would define her existence. She chose to embrace Lutheranism, drawn not only by theological convictions, but by a desire for autonomy that the movement represented. Her decision, echoing the choices of countless individuals across the empire, underscored the personal stakes entwined with the broader historical narrative. Inevitably, the peace established in Augsburg did not signify the end of religious conflict in Europe. The limited scope of the treaty sowed the seeds for future wars of religion, as groups not included in the agreement sought recognition and representation. In the decades that followed, the 30 Years' War would erupt, drawing entire nations into its devastating wake and leading to profound questions about the nature of tolerance and coexistence. The fragility of the arrangement was evident. Had different factions within the empire rallied together in a more unified front, the outcomes might have been drastically different. The ramifications of the Augsburg settlement would reverberate through the halls of power, shaping the governance and cultural identities of generations to come. The legacy of the Peace of Augsburg extends far beyond its immediate impact on the Holy Roman Empire. It planted the seeds of modern concepts of religious tolerance and pluralism, concepts that would continue to evolve and resonate through the Enlightenment and into contemporary society. The struggles faced in the 16th century have remained relevant as nations grapple with the legacies of intolerance and the challenges of coexistence. The very idea that one's faith could be dictated by the whims of a local sovereign is a notion that still echoes in the debates surrounding religious freedom today. In sum, the Peace of Augsburg stands as a critical turning point in the narrative of the Reformation, illustrating the complex interplay of faith, governance, and individual rights. It marked the moment when the fabric of European society began to weave together diverse religious identities, albeit in a manner fraught with tension and compromise. The echoes of that compromise are still felt in the modern world, an enduring testament to the struggles and sacrifices of those who lived through this transformative period, always reminding us that the threads of history are woven by the choices of individuals caught in the grip of their times.
The Reformation, which erupted across Europe in the early 16th century, was not merely a schism within the Christian faith. It was a catalyst that reshaped the very fabric of European society, the echoes of which reverberate through to the present day. The act of nailing Martin Luther's 95 Theses to the door of the Wittenberg Castle Church in 1517 was more than an act of defiance. It was a moment that illuminated an expanding consciousness among the populace, igniting a fervent quest for individual interpretation of Scripture and belief. Driven by this surge of spiritual and intellectual awakening, the printing press emerged as a revolutionary tool, its presses turning out pamphlets, Bibles, and essays that democratized access to knowledge and religious texts. Consequently, this dissemination of ideas not only transformed the religious landscape, but also heralded profound changes in education and literacy, fostering a new European identity that thrived on critical inquiry and personal agency. In the decades that followed, the Reformation catalyzed a seismic shift in educational practices across Europe. Schools, once the privilege of the clergy and aristocracy, began to sprout in towns and cities, open to the burgeoning middle class. The writings of reformers like John Calvin and Luther emphasized the importance of reading the Bible, thus making literacy a necessity rather than a luxury. For many, the ability to read became synonymous with empowerment. Young men and women, once relegated to the margins of society, now found themselves at the center of a movement that advocated for their intellectual and spiritual rights. The establishment of institutions such as the University of Geneva in 1559 underscored this shift, where education sought to intertwine faith with reason. The spirit of the age was one of awakening. People were no longer content to accept doctrines passed down through generations without question. The very act of reading and interpreting Scripture led to a burgeoning sense of individualism, altering the collective psyche of Europe, which began to see itself not merely as a collection of kingdoms, but as a community bound by a shared ethos of inquiry and self-governance. This newfound emphasis on education naturally extended into the realm of governance. The Reformation's call for reform was not solely spiritual, it had far-reaching implications for political structures as well. In the wake of religious upheaval, monarchs and civic leaders began to grapple with the idea of statecraft that aligned with the will of the people. The political philosophies emerging from this period, notably through the writings of thinkers like Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, began to probe the relationship between the governed and their rulers. Inevitably, this evolution in thought fostered the early seeds of modern democracy, with the populace advocating for representation and the right to challenge authority. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648, which ended the devastating 30 Years' War, codified the principle of state sovereignty, reinforcing the notion that governing powers derived their legitimacy from the consent of the governed, a radical departure from the divine right of kings that had held sway for centuries. Simultaneously, the Reformation fostered profound cultural shifts. As Protestantism spread, so too did ideas of secularism, which began to permeate the artistic and intellectual realms of European life. The Renaissance, already a period marked by a revival of classical thought, found new expression in a society increasingly willing to challenge the status quo. Figures such as Rembrandt and Shakespeare epitomized this moment, weaving themes of individual struggle and moral complexity into their work, reflecting an evolving human experience grounded in both faith and doubt. Driven by the cultural tumult of the time, the arts became a mirror to the collective identity shaped by the Reformation, celebrating the human condition in its myriad forms. As artists and thinkers grappled with the implications of faith, the everyday lives of ordinary people began to take center stage in the narrative of European culture, shifting the focus from a singular divine order to the multifaceted experiences of humanity. Yet, amid these sweeping changes, the Reformation also revealed the fragility of human affairs. Had the voices of dissent, such as Luther's, been silenced by stronger monarchical powers, the trajectory of European history could have been starkly different. The consolidation of power by the Catholic Church might have stifled the burgeoning individualism, leaving Europe in a state of intellectual stagnation. The very act of printing, a seemingly mundane technological advancement, had created a cascading effect that was unpredictable and far-reaching. The connections forged by pamphlets and treatises laid the groundwork for revolutions yet to come, from the English Civil War to the American Revolution, as people across continents sought to assert their rights and shape their destinies. To ground this monumental shift in human experience, consider the life of Anna, a young woman living in the shadow of Wittenberg in the early 1520s. A seamstress by trade, Anna found herself ensnared in the fervor of reformist discourse, her hands stitching garments, while her mind wrestled with the words of Luther and the implications of a faith that urged her to think for herself. Each evening, as she gathered with her neighbors to share news of the latest pamphlet or sermon, she felt the weight of history pressing upon her, the world she knew slowly unraveling and reweaving itself in a fabric of newfound ideas. Anna's story, though perhaps unrecorded in the annals of history, symbolizes the countless individuals whose lives were irrevocably altered by the tectonic shifts wrought by the Reformation. As Europe emerged from the shadows of the Reformation, it began to forge a new identity, one that embraced complexity and contradiction. The legacies of literacy, democratic thought, and cultural expression that emerged from this tumultuous period continue to resonate in today's global society. The principles of individual rights and secular governance, seeds planted in the fertile ground of dissent, have grown into the frameworks that underpin modern democracies. As we navigate the complexities of contemporary existence, we must acknowledge that the echoes of that 16th century upheaval still inform our understanding of identity and agency. The Reformation taught Europe that change is not merely possible, but inevitable, a reminder that the currents of history are shaped not only by grand events, but also by the quiet, resolute struggles of individuals like Anna, who sought to carve out their own place in an evolving world. In this light, the legacy of the Reformation is not just a tale of faith, but a profound exploration of what it means to be human in the ever-continuing journey of history.